In this episode,
The key question I'm really interested in is, what is the self? What is consciousness when viewed introspectively? What is its structure, and what are the parts, and what do those different parts do?
The idea that this toggle, as you put it, between these two systems, like on the one hand, there's exerting conscious control, and on the other hand, there's letting yourself just be run by your subconscious associational mechanism. What's the big deal? Why is this so glorious to toggle it one way rather than the other? The point I just want to make is that the effects of toggling one way compound tremendously over time. So any one given choice to toggle it, to choose to think or choose to focus rather than not, is not going to have dramatic, obvious, life-changing effects, but repeated over time, over years, it can make a huge difference. It could make the difference between having an awesome life and having a horrible, crappy, boring life. I've been doing so much on selfishness, but there are other aspects of philosophy that I'm interested in talking about. So I invite everybody else in the world to get in touch with me. And if you want to have a philosophical conversation about anything, I invite you to. If you want to throw in a donation, that will help. And I encourage you to subscribe to my channel or follow me on Facebook. I don't usually do this kind of plugging for my own stuff in my videos, but I'm trying to grow my channel and build an audience and be able to support myself.
You should probably do this at the beginning instead of after 2.5 hours.
Yeah, maybe I should.
Nobody gets to all the way to the end.
I should cut this clip up and paste it in the front. Welcome to another episode of my YouTube channel. Usually I start my videos by saying, this is another episode of the Selfishness Project. You might know that I have a lot of videos on the topic of selfishness, but I've actually decided recently to expand my horizons beyond just the topic of selfishness. So today I'm here with Sean Silsby, who I met several years ago at an Objectivist conference. And recently I got in touch with him again through, maybe it was Facebook. I've been active on Facebook recently talking about my selfishness projects. And some people got in touch with me they expressed interest in having philosophical conversations, not necessarily just on the topic of selfishness. And that was something that I was happy to do. My actual area of research specialty when I was a graduate student was not the topic of selfishness. It was actually, as a master's student, I focused on free will. And as a doctoral student, I focused on the philosophy of mind, also known as the metaphysics of consciousness, or the mind-body problem. The relation of the mind and the brain is also how it's sometimes put. And Sean got in touch with me, and he said that he was interested in discussing some issues that were more related to that kind of research that I just described doing when I was a graduate student. So I was happy to have a conversation about those kinds of topics, and he generously offered to pay for doing this. So I was especially happy to have this conversation with him. So he had a list of topics that he sent me in advance and some links to videos that were relevant to topics he wanted to talk about. So I'm just going to turn this over to you, Sean, and let you bring up in whatever order you'd like, whatever you'd like to discuss, and then we'll just go from there.
Sure. So as you said, your normal line of discussion on your YouTube channel is about selfishness. And I think we could tie this discussion into that a little bit, because the key question I'm really interested in is, what is the self? And I think there are multiple senses in which that is used. The one in ethics may be a little peripheral to what I'm interested in here. The questions that I'm more interested in are about sort of the structure of consciousness and the mind, not so much the metaphysical relationship of consciousness and matter, the sort of core mind-body problem that you might be more familiar with, but more what is consciousness when viewed introspectively? What is its structure, and what are the parts, and what do those different parts do? So maybe we could start, your background, I think, is outside of academic philosophy, is Rand's philosophy, objectivism. I'm also pretty familiar with objectivism. So maybe we could start by talking about kind of the objectivist view of the mind, get clear on what that is, and then maybe we can branch out and talk about other theories, some things that I've been reading recently. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
So I think so I'll say my view of the mind up until recently, I think matches fairly well with Rand's view, or at least the view of other objectivist philosophers like Harry Binswanger, which is that there are sort of two basic pieces to it. There's the subconscious, which is perhaps identified with the physical brain. It's sort of various processes that run beneath the level of consciousness that you're not normally aware of, but that provide material to the conscious mind, which is the second part. And I think the common sense view, and also the objectivist view, is that the conscious mind is this sort of active entity that takes the material provided by the subconscious, does things with it, and then perhaps sends it back or produces actions in the body, right? And the conscious mind is often associated with volition. We say that at least some of the actions of the conscious mind are volitional. They're not determined by anything in the physical brain. They're generated by some sort of mental entity that we can associate with that consciousness. So I'd be interested to get your comments on that model. Do you think that's an accurate description of the basic view here? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that does sound like an accurate description of the objectivist view of the mind. And moreover, I find the view myself to be plausible. It seems to cohere well with my own experience, introspecting on the nature of my own minds. It does seem that I experience control, volitional control over my mind. I can choose to think. I can control the actions of my body. And it does seem that there's this kind of interaction between the subconscious and the conscious mind, where the subconscious, which you could think of it as the brain, it somehow sends up material into the conscious minds, things that you're not currently thinking about, like the fact that JFK was shot in 1963. That wasn't something that was in my consciousness 10 minutes ago, but somehow that information popped into my conscious mind right now. So where was that information before? It was in my conscious mind. Well, that's what we call the subconscious, where this material, which is not presently in consciousness, but could be in consciousness, is located. And when it's not in consciousness, it's stored somehow in neural form. I guess there's neural connections. That's a scientific question. exactly how it's stored physically, but somehow it's stored physically, and it had to get stored physically in the first place. I think it had to enter through consciousness. So at one time I read a book or saw a movie or something about JFK, and I was conscious of that, what I was reading or of the movie I was watching, and that conscious experience got stored physically somehow inside of me. And then after the movie was over, or after I finished reading the book, that information is no longer in my conscious mind, yet it has the potential to come back into consciousness, as it just did, as some random fact that I thought of a minute ago. So I think there is, sometimes it happens automatically. I wasn't deliberately fishing for that fact, but that's what popped up for whatever reason. So there was something automatic about that. It wasn't volitional. I mean, maybe it was volitional that I wanted some example of some fact that was stored in my consciousness, and I said, in effect, brain, give me something. Shoot something up to me to give me an example. And maybe that act of requesting an example was volitional, but that particular fact came up was not volitional. That's just whatever the brain automatically sent me. So this is just one example. Emotions are another example of something that I think introspectively, it seems right to me that you feel certain ways without choosing to. I don't volitionally decide, now I'm going to be happy, or now I'm going to be sad or angry or delighted. No, you just automatically experience these emotions in a way that's something like thinking is not automatic. So I could assign myself a math problem right now. I could say, what is the product of 73 and 15? And I could try to do in my head 73 times 15. And that takes some effort. The answer does not automatically pop into my mind, as is the case with like 2 times 2, right? Because that's so simple and automatized. I haven't automatized 73 times 15 or 12, whatever I said. So that I can observe myself introspectively working on. And at any moment, I have this sense I can stop. I could start multiplying in my head the ones column and then the ones times the tens column. And then I could say, this is too much effort. I just want to stop this. And I might just give up, choose to give up in the middle of that problem. And that's a different experience than the experience of having an emotion where it just hits you and you don't feel like you really had a choice about that hitting you. So I've gone on for a while here, but just to summarize, I think the way you describe the objectivist view of the mind and its relation to the subconscious or the brain, it sounded accurate, and it also seems to cohere with my experience of things. So I'll throw it back to you.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things I'm interested in is you mentioned a couple examples of actions that seem to be volitional or voluntary in some way versus things that just happen automatically. So for example, a fact might just pop into your head, but it might pop into your head in response to a question that you asked from your conscious mind to your subconscious mind in this model. So one of the things I've always been a little unclear on in the objectivist view is what exactly is volitional in that type of action. So there's this core choice, what's often called a fundamental choice or primary choice in objectivism, to focus your mind, right? And I think different people have maybe interpreted that in different ways, and maybe it's not entirely clear what Rand actually meant by that, or what other objectivist philosophers actually mean by that. And then how that relates to more concrete examples of voluntary action, like doing a math problem, like you just described, like exerting that effort to multiply two numbers together, or asking yourself a question and getting a response from your subconscious. And in some sense, it seems like in all of the cases where you perform some sort of concrete action like that, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Like if you are asking yourself a particular question, say, when was JFK assassinated? Like I don't, 1963 doesn't just pop into my head like that. Maybe you've studied history a little more recently than I have. But yeah, so I have to exert some mental effort, and there is definitely a voluntary, or you could say volitional, experience associated with that effort. But the actual question itself doesn't seem to be produced by consciousness, right? That question itself had to come from somewhere. So in some sense, it seems like there's a loop where the subconscious is maybe driving a goal or purpose, and then there's some effort involved in maintaining that purpose or applying it in specific ways. And then, so your subconscious might give you a question like, when was JFK assassinated? Then there's the exertion of effort there to go back and retrieve the next bit of information, which then moves you forward in your thinking process. So yeah, so I guess I'm curious what you think is directly volitional in those types of actions versus what ultimately comes from the subconscious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think sometimes, at least, questions are suggested by the subconscious. They're not something that you deliberately choose to ask. A question might just pop into your head. And then once it's into your mind, if we want to be more precise, head being a physical thing and mind being something that you might think is non-physical. That gets into another discussion. So yeah, I do think sometimes questions can just pop into your minds or head, loosely speaking. And then maybe it's more clear that whether to pursue those questions is volitional. Like the math example I was giving, you could sense as you're doing this, as it's taking effort on your part to continue this problem, you can exert the willpower to continue trying to find the answer to that question, or you could give up. But the question itself might be non-volitional. But I think maybe some questions are volitional. Like you could have the question, what is the right question to be asking on some problem? If you, I don't know what would be a good example of this, but sometimes I've heard this saying that's a large part of getting the right answer to some problem is asking the right questions. It's not always obvious what the right question is to ask, but once you do ask it, which I think is a way of framing some issue in the right way, then certain answers which would be helpful are going to be more readily available to you. I'm just to make this a little more concrete, I'm thinking of a question related to the climate debate. One question you could ask is, how do we minimize human impact on the climate? Another question you could ask is, how do we maximize human flourishing? And Alex Epstein is very much focused on this issue of framing things in the right way. And he thinks the focus in the climate debates in the culture should rather be on this latter question. The goal shouldn't be to minimize human impact. It should be to maximize human flourishing. So, but it might not be obvious. That's the right question to ask. How do we maximize human flourishing? So there might be an effortful process required in order to figure out what that question is. What is the right question to ask? Although there might be some questions that do just pop into your mind automatically, there might be other questions which don't, but which are important to figure out. And it requires some kind of efforts to get to those right questions. So I don't want to make a principle like every time a question is in your mind, it's something that's popped up automatically. Whereas there's
so
some
I'm
other...
thinking more of, so there's kind of the act of asking a question abstractly, with the content removed. And then there is the content of the specific question that you're asking. And it seems to me that that content always ultimately has to come from your subconscious. Just if for no other reason, then usually the question comes up in the form of like an English sentence, right? Your conscious mind I wouldn't think your conscious mind can just generate English sentences on its own. All of that material ultimately has to come up from some brain subsystem that essentially generates these strings of text, right? So do you think the core volitional act is just kind of exerting effort so your subconscious notifies you that there's some effort needed here to ask a question, and then your conscious mind decides, do I exert that effort or do I not? And this maybe relates to Rand's framing of the core choice as to think or not, versus kind of the specific content of your thinking, which maybe always comes from the brain ultimately.
Yeah, that sounds right. So what we have direct control over is whether we exert that effort to think or not, and the particular content that comes into our minds isn't directly under our control. And maybe in some cases there's a way in which it is, but I think there's something right about what you said, and it's in that it's what's directly under our control is performing a certain action with our minds, deciding to think, or she also sometimes puts it as focus. The primary choice is to focus or not, and that's an action. Focusing your mind, that's not getting a certain content to come into your mind. Although once you do choose to engage in that action, that's going to cause certain contents to come in which might have been different had you not made that choice. So if you're not making the choice to focus or to think, there could very well still be things that come into your mind, but they might not be as relevant as they could be. So your subconscious can just make these random associations with things, and stuff can pop into your mind which isn't the most relevant. Whereas if you exert this sense of control over your mind, if you seize the reins, so to speak, then it's more likely that relevant content is going to enter your mind, which would be more helpful for whatever task you then decide to pursue.
So if the volitional choice really boils down to this one core choice to focus or not, or to think or not, to exert effort or not, however you want to frame it, do you think there is ever a benefit to not doing that? Do you think there's a reason? So one of the issues I've had with this concept is it seems like in any particular choice you make, there's sort of maybe three possibilities. There's either you So say you're facing sort of a binary choice, like exert the effort to ask this question or not, or ask this question versus this question, right? Either there's something already in your conscious mind that indicates that one of these choices is better than the other, in which case it seems like it would always benefit you to make that choice, or there's no sense in your mind that one of the choices is better than the other, in which case you might as well just pick randomly. Maybe there's just those two possibilities. I thought there was a third one, but it basically what I'm getting at is like, if the fundamental choice is this choice to focus or not, and it's always better to focus than not to focus, what's the point of having the choice? Why is this powerful and important that human beings have this fundamental free will choice? And wouldn't we be better off, for example, if we were just hardwired evolutionarily to always make the right choice? And so let me rephrase that in the latter context, the sort of evolutionary context. Given those two cases where you're making a choice and there's some sense in your mind that one of the choices is better than the other, it seems like evolutionarily it would benefit you to be hardwired to always make the choice that you think is better. And if there's no obvious better choice, you might as well just throw a die, you know, or flip a coin and make one of those choices. So what do you think is really the importance of the ability to make that choice to focus or not?
So on the evolution point, there might, let's suppose that we would be better off evolutionarily if we were automatically wired so that we focus our minds rather than not. So there wasn't really a choice to focus or not. We just automatically went into focus. And there might be times when it's good not to focus, like if you're trying to fall asleep, maybe it's conducive to that to let your mind unfocus and just go into a state of drift, not be at the reins, very alert. And
but even in that type of situation, you would have to have some sense in your conscious mind that this is the right thing to do right now, right? That it's okay right now to go to sleep. In which case, it seems like in that scenario, there's still kind of an optimal choice that you could be wired to make. Just speaking hypothetically, obviously it doesn't quite work like this because we know we can make bad choices, but just you know, there seems to be this sense in objectivism that this choice to focus or not is really important, that it sort of underlies ethics and even the ability to have knowledge and make arguments. And I'm trying to get at kind of why is that really? If the choice really just boils down to focus your mind or not, which seems like a very kind of simplistic and not super useful on its face kind of choice.
well, I mean, it could just be a fact of human nature. I think it plausibly is that we have this fundamental choice to make, and it might not be a complicated choice. There's just this basic alternative: think or not, or focus your mind or not. And you know, could evolution come up with something better so that there's an even better way for us to achieve our survival than to have this ability to choose to focus? I don't know. Maybe in a billion or a trillion years of additional evolution or scientific advancement, some other way of achieving human well-being will come into being. And then at that point, you know, there might be something else we could do that would be the best way for us to act, assuming we have a choice. I mean, perhaps in a trillion years, we will evolve into a non-volitional species that can survive even better than the current volitional species that we are. It's kind of a sci-fi thing to think about. But in any case, given the beings that we are at this point in evolutionary history, it's a fact, or at least objectivism holds that it's a fact, that we do have this choice. And it is of fundamental importance, given our nature, that we choose in a certain way. I mean, our lives will go much better if we do choose to focus and think than if we don't choose to focus and think. I mean, all the technology that we use in our lives to make our lives go better is a product of thinking. And that was volitional. Thinking is a volitional. We had to choose to think to create discover all the scientific laws and so forth that were then implemented in technology. So it was hugely important that we made this choice, that we make the choice to think. It's fundamental to our well-being as human beings. So I think that's why it's so important. And I think it's a separate issue as to, well, could there be some other species that might evolve in some other way where we don't have to make this choice? I don't know that you were exactly asking that question, but I think the issue of what evolution has come up with so far, I don't think really impacts the issue of whether, given what it's come up with to date, whether in our current context it's important that we make this choice. Let me pause there and throw it back to you.
Yeah. I think that basically matches kind of what I expected that you would say, or what I've thought about this same kind of problem. And it basically kind of boils down to, well, maybe you could construct another species that didn't face this choice and always made the optimal choice, but that's not the way it works, right? We do face this choice. That's just a fact, and therefore you have to continually make this choice. But if that is the case, it seems to me like having free will, if that's all free will is kind of a disadvantage rather than an advantage. It means there's some part of you that just doesn't work all the time. So imagine, there's this sense of the choice to focus is kind of flipping a switch. And I don't know if you'd agree with this analogy, but I kind of think of that as sort of toggling between two systems. There's the automatic sort of subconscious, just random association system that can run your life if you're not in focus. And if you make this focused choice, it sort of flips control to this second system that is more deliberative, that involves conscious decisions rather than subconscious decisions. And maybe objectivism would associate with that is consciousness, that second system that's taking control of your actions. But it seems like, yeah, if that's all the choice is, to toggle between those two systems, and it's always beneficial to you to use the second system, the more conscious deliberative system instead of the random subconscious associational system, it seems like the choice to focus is just sort of a burden that is placed on you by your nature. It's like, oh, I wish I could just automatically turn on this second system and think consciously instead of subconsciously all the time. Does that kind of make sense to you? So I just like, so the way Rand talks about volition, it's sort of this great thing that man can be heroic because he can make choices, and his life isn't determined by anything prior. But based on this sense of just the choice to focus or not, it seems like you could validly take the alternative view that's maybe more pessimistic, that, well, there's the part of you that does the right thing just doesn't work all the time, and you have to constantly put in this effort to keep it going. And that doesn't seem that powerful or interesting in certain ways. I don't know. Does that kind of make sense to you? What would be your response to that kind of way of framing the issue?
It's, so you use this term burden, and so from that way of framing it, I can see how it might seem kind of a drag to have this free will. Wouldn't it be great if I could just kind of coast and not have to exert this effort? But I think there's another way to look at it. You might see this as liberating. And so instead of being confined to follow some deterministic program, we are freed from that. Our volitional capacity allows us to do something new. So in a way, it might seem freeing.
So let me, don't mean to interrupt you, but I do mean to interrupt you.
Go
just
ahead.
to kind of hit on that point specifically, because I think that's important. There's this sense that having this choice to focus or not frees us from our deterministic program, right? But if all the choice is sort of toggling another system in your mind, I don't really see how that frees you from the deterministic program. It basically just changes to a different deterministic program that's better, right? Like the type of free will that seems worth having, that would seem powerful, is free will over specific actions. So, for example, going back to the types of things we were talking about asking questions, it seems like the type of free will that would be interesting is if you had free will to generate new questions for yourself out of the blue, and not always just be following questions produced by your subconscious, if that makes sense. So it just seems like that if focus is kind of kickstarting this thinking process, and then that thinking process just kind of plods along and goes on its own as long as you continue to exert that effort to keep it going, and your only choice is to stop it or keep it going, it doesn't seem like that really frees you from the deterministic program. It just, you're just continually getting new stuff from your subconscious, processing it somehow. You have to exert effort to do that processing, and then it goes back and you continue the cycle. Does that kind of make sense?
Well, as a description of how things work, I think it's intelligible, and I think seems accurate. But then there's the question of like, how to evaluate this? So it seems like you want to evaluate this as kind of I don't know what the word is, boring or uninteresting, not very inspiring kind of picture, whereas Rand might present this as a glorious kind of thing. So is it just the evaluation issue here that I mean, if you,
so maybe so there's this sense, if you're familiar with these types of arguments, maybe you can elaborate on them, or your understanding of these types of arguments. But there's a sense in philosophy that we can't have moral judgment or moral responsibility without free will, for example. And that is one of the things that makes free will seem powerful, that you are now morally responsible for your actions, right? And then there's the second argument that I know is made in objectivism. I think Nathaniel Branden made it. Harry Benswanger has made it. That without free will, you can't. So it basically that if you don't have free will, knowledge is impossible, because you are ultimately just everything that you believe and think you know is just determined by physical processes, right? And you don't know the deepest level of causes for your beliefs. So everything that you believe, everything that you want to convince other people of, you had to believe due to physical processes that you're unaware of, right? And that therefore you don't have grounds to say, I believe this because it's true. You have to say, I believe it because my genes made me believe it, or my atoms bounced around in a certain way and made me believe it, right? And that somehow having free will breaks that that deterministic spell and allows you to have knowledge and know that you believe something because it's true, not because you were determined to believe it. And I guess I'm skeptical that the kind of free will that exists in objectivism really breaks that spell, if it's really just toggling another system that is less random and more structured, deliberative thought, if that makes sense. And same thing for the kind of moral argument. It seems like, so if you're not in focus, your actions could be kind of random just based on whatever subconscious associations are going on. Maybe you go punch somebody just because you get mad at them and you're not conscious of it, and that's just what you automatically do. Whereas if you were in focus, your more deliberative mind would take over and come up with a reason why punching them is bad. But ultimately that reason still has to come from your subconscious somewhere. It's just coming from a different part of your subconscious. So if you were in focus and your subconscious didn't produce a reason why you shouldn't punch somebody, you might still punch them. So it seems like you're ultimately still kind of at the mercy of your unconscious brain processes, regardless of whether you are in focus or not. It's just a different type of brain processes that govern your action.
So I made the point before that when you're in focus, more relevant content will pop into your minds when you choose to answer some question. So I'm a little reluctant to go along with the idea that you're at the mercy. Like when you put it that way, I mean, in some sense, you're not controlling what comes up, but in some sense you are. Like you might not have control over the exact thing that comes up, but you might have control over the general category of thing that comes up if you exert this control. So trying to think of how to make this concrete. Like if you ask some question that's, I don't know, let's see what pops up into my minds as a example question. What did I eat 3 days ago for breakfast? Well, I don't know if this is a good example, because I always eat the same thing. I have a bowl of oatmeal with a banana. But I guess if it's a question where it's not, the answer is not obvious because it's not always the same, then you would more likely see the advantage of being in focus. I wish I had a better example ready to hand here. maybe I don't know if the climate question would work well here, like the difference between asking what minimizes human impact versus what maximizes human flourishing. So here no, I don't think that's going to, okay, that's getting at two different types of questions, whereas I think I want two different types of answers. So maybe one type of, or one category of answer that might come to your mind is, maybe this is better. What kind of career should I pursue? And one type of answer that could occur to you is, well, what's a prestigious thing? What are people in society think is good? What are other people doing? Maybe I should be a doctor or a lawyer. It's kind of a stereotyped answer of what a prestigious career might be. Another category of answer that could occur to you is, well, what do I like to do? What do I enjoy doing? Whether or not it's seen as prestigious by other people. So does the choice to focus make one of those types of answers come up rather than the other? Maybe if you're unfocused, you will more likely irrelevant considerations will come into mind, like, what do other people think about this career? What does my mother want me to do? As opposed to, what am I really passionate about? Assuming that's a more relevant consideration. I think, so going back to this idea of being at the mercy of your subconscious, I suspect that you're more likely to get relevant information popping up if you exert this control than if you don't. And in that way, you're not at the mercy, you're not at the total mercy. You might not get the right answer, the most relevant consideration popping into your mind at first. Maybe you'll think, oh, well, I'm passionate about history. I do like studying that, which is true in my case, but I also like studying philosophy. And so how do I integrate those? Do I make one a hobby and the other my central purpose? If so, which one? And this is something I've actually thought about. But and I think I can see myself having this internal dialogue about what career to pursue while I'm in focus. Whereas if I were just unsatisfied with where my career was at a certain point, and I just emotionally feel bad about it, I know there's something not right about it, but I just kind of stew in my negative emotion. I might just, I don't know, latch on to the first thing that pops in. Oh, my brother, he seems successful and making a lot of money, and he works in IT. So maybe I should just do IT, information technology. Yeah, I'm going to do that. And then I start Googling that online, finding out what job openings there are. But it really has no attachment at all to what I've been passionate about for years. I mean, I'm not really interested in that. But I think if I am exerting this control over my thought process, then I think I will be attuned to the right category of suggestions from my subconscious. So it would be more like deciding between focusing on philosophy or history rather than information technology or some other random, more or less random field as far as my life is concerned. which my subconscious might propose to me if I'm not exerting this control. So, so I've been going on for a while here, so let me just pause it and turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so I think that, so maybe let's move on to a slightly different topic, but I think that, so that basically matches my understanding of kind of what the choice does. This choice to think or focus or whatever, it will cause different types of things to come up from your subconscious, and those will probably be better things than the things that would randomly be produced out of focus, right? But it still just doesn't seem like this kind of transformative choice that has the extreme significance that is sometimes placed on it, just because it's such a basic choice to just kind of do a certain type of action versus yeah, I would frame it in terms of kind of using a certain type of system to control your actions versus using a different type of system. And maybe this gets into some of the other material I wanted to talk about on kind of the different views of how the mind works and the nature of the self as sort of the agent of action. So as I wrote to you earlier, you know, my philosophical background, if you can call it that, I'm not a philosopher, but just sort of as a layman and somewhat of a hobbyist philosopher, I guess, is primarily grounded in objectivism from when I was in high school, right? But in the past couple of years, I've been getting interested in this mindfulness meditation material. And I started doing that as sort of a form of therapy. There are types of therapies for anxiety and depression that involve meditation as part of them. So that's kind of how I got into it. But then I started reading some of the more, you could call it secular Buddhist material, I guess, from people like Sam Harris, Robert Wright, this guy that goes by Kuldasa. And they get into more sort of the theory behind meditation and the idea that you can use it not only to kind of calm yourself down, reduce stress and anxiety and such, but that you can use it as a way to kind of discover the nature of the mind, right? And basically the idea, so the primary place I'm drawing this material from, I guess, is Sam Harris's app. So he has a meditation app where he has like an introductory course that you go through for 50 days. And then he has various other courses from different people that you go through, and he has daily meditations, right? And his whole thing, if you read his book or go through the course, is about breaking what he calls the illusion of the self, right? And I think there are multiple things that are meant by that. But basically the idea is that as you become a sort of more advanced meditator, as you're able to calm your mind, stop getting lost in the thoughts that kind of automatically bombard you, and get a clearer picture of what's actually going on in your mind, this idea that there is sort of a central entity that is making decisions and making volitional choices, and even he thinks that is the subject of experience, the sense that there is this self entity kind of goes away or is seen to be illusory, right? And, you know, I'm not an advanced meditator. I'm not an enlightened Buddha, right? But I've seen sort of, as I progressed in this material and done more of the daily meditations and so forth, I can see what they're talking about, right? There is this sense of when you just observe what's going on in your mind, more and more as you start to see it less clouded by all the chaos that normally goes on, there's a sense that everything is just sort of happening. And the model of the mind that maybe seems to fit this better than the model we've been talking about is a model of the mind where there are multiple different systems or subsystems that are all kind of doing their own thing at the same time. And depending on various things, we could say whether you're in focus or not. I think it's still valid to make that kind of distinction, what mood you're in, etc. Different subsystems may become dominant and drive your thoughts and actions in different ways. But ultimately, all these subsystems are sort of operating on a subconscious level, and consciousness, rather than this active kind of director of your thoughts and actions, is basically just a passive observer. It's kind of a space where all the different subsystems interact with each other. So your percepts come in from your senses, and then various other subsystems pick those up from consciousness, and bring up concepts or memories or emotions or something like that, and other subsystems will take that material and run with it. And so this sort of model of in focus versus out of focus, in that model of the mind, would become sort of a toggle between a more deliberative, slow, you could say rational subsystem that maybe corresponds to a different part of the brain than more sort of emotion-driven, automatic, faster subsystems that might be active when you're not exerting effort or doing voluntary action. And we can maybe talk about whether there's a distinction between voluntary action or volitional action. So I'd be interested to hear kind of your thoughts on that type of model of the mind. Maybe if you think there's something wrong with it, what's wrong with it, especially from the point of view of introspective experience. Like, I had heard of this sort of thing coming from psychologists, like experimental psychologists, neuroscientists and such, that there's evidence extrospectively, when you look at how the brain works, that it's actually this collection of various systems with no kind of central manager. But it wasn't really convincing to me until I had that introspective experience that, yeah, that kind of matches what I'm observing in my mind better to me than this model where I am this central self directing everything, right? Which I think is kind of more of the model you get in objectivism. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on those contrasting views and kind of what would you think is kind of the introspective evidence for each of them, and what do you think would be wrong with the more, what sometimes is called the modular mind. The mind is a collection of different subsystems.
Okay. I just want to make one point before I get into that, relating to the previous discussion, which is the idea that this toggle, as you put it, between these two systems, like on the one hand, there's exerting conscious control, and on the other hand, there's letting yourself just be run by your subconscious associational mechanism. What's the big deal? Why is this so glorious to toggle it one way rather than the other? The point I just want to make is that the effects of toggling one way compound tremendously over time. So any one given choice to toggle it, to choose to think or choose to focus rather than not, is not going to have dramatic, obvious, life-changing effects, but repeated over time, over years, it can make a huge difference. It could make the difference between having an awesome life and having a horrible, crappy, boring life. Contrast, James Taggart with Dagny Taggart from Atlas Shrugged. I mean, these are people who, over time, one has been consistently choosing to toggle one way to keep her mind in gear, focused on reality. The other has been not making that choice. And his life is spinning, sorry for the plot spoilers, anyone who's watching this, his life spins out of control, and it's a disaster for him, but she achieves happiness, gets the man she wants, has a beautiful future ahead of her. So on an individual level, over time, the effects are dramatic. And also on a cultural scale, if you have a culture of evasion, people not choosing to focus their minds, maybe a whole culture who indulges in mysticism, you might get something like the Dark Ages, you know, centuries of stagnation and brutality, as opposed to, you know, an era like the scientific revolution, where people are in the Enlightenment, people are focused, their minds are in gear and trying to understand things they deal with, and eventually great technology and wonderful things are produced as a result of that. So yeah, in any given choice, it might not be obvious that there are these two differences, but over time, you know, the effects add up, and it is a dramatic difference. So I just wanted to make that point. But now, getting to what you were just talking about of these, so Sam Harris has this model of the mind, and other people, they call it the modular theory of mind, where there's not one central agent in control of things. Rather, there's just this collection of different subsystems. I guess, so one thought is, I guess you could operate in that way if you toggle it in a certain way, as I've just been saying. Like if you consistently don't choose to seize the reins of your own minds, then yeah, maybe it does seem introspectively like there's just these competing factions, which aren't really you, but it's just this stuff popping up into your mind, and they're just fighting with each other, and one might dominate in a given case, but you've just surrendered your mind to anything that your subconscious might throw up. And but it's a choice to surrender your mind in that way. At least I think it's plausible that it is. You don't have to do that, but if you do make that choice, then I can see how introspectively it could seem like there's no one central agent who's in control of things, but you've kind of chosen to make it that way. Although even then, there might be, even if there's not a central agent controlling things, there might still seem, and I haven't done this meditation myself, so I'm not really speaking from firsthand experience here, but just thinking about it now, it seems like it might still seem that there's at least an agent who is aware of what's going on, if not in control of it. So if I do choose to surrender the reins of my minds, then, and I'll just allow myself to be buffeted around, puppet-like, I have lost the sense of control, but I might still have the sense of there's one person who's aware of these competing factions. And I guess you wouldn't, I don't know if you would have the perspective to think that there are these competing factions unless there were some one unitary thing that's aware of all these different factions. Because if you're just one of these factions, then how do you get the perspective at all that there's like this arena of different modules that are competing with each other? Doesn't there have to be some kind of unified perspective on the whole to even get this idea that there are modules within it that are, you know, jockeying for control? So those are a couple of my initial thoughts on this theory.
So let me describe kind of the core experience, at least that I have with this sort of meditation. And maybe, you know, it's difficult to describe introspective experience, but maybe that will indicate why I find this view plausible, or why people that promote this type of meditation think that it demonstrates this kind of lack of a central self, right? So the basic instruction, there are different types of meditation, but the the most basic kind is you're just trying to keep your attention focused on a specific object, essentially. Usually the breath, but it could be an external object, you know, various sensations in your body or something like that. But the breath is kind of the simplest and most common thing. So you kind of either close your eyes or keep your eyes open and just kind of bring your attention to the experience of breathing in a particular part of your body, your nose or your chest or whatever. And you just try to kind of keep your attention focused there, observing the experience of that breath. And then the experience that people have is their mind just wanders. So you could think of the, if there's a sort of central controlling volitional self, what that self is trying to do is keep your attention focused on the breath and just watch the breath, right? And then what happens is various other things come into your mind. You start noticing things in the world or in your visual field or in your body, right? And your attention just gets pulled on its own away from the breath to something else, right? So you've completely forgotten that you are trying to focus on the breath, right? So that if there is that sort of central self that is trying to maintain this purpose of focus on the breath, it's lost control, right? And then the experience is you maybe spend a couple seconds or maybe a couple minutes kind of lost in this train of thought or experience or whatever that has nothing to do with the purpose you had. And then at some point there's a kind of aha moment where you remember, oh yeah, I was trying to focus on my breath. And then you come back, right? So the experience is kind of one of, you have this purpose that some part of you is trying to hold on to, right? But that part of you, no matter how much effort you put into this, and even some people suggest that putting too much effort into it is actually counterproductive, there is some other part of you that is yanking your attention away from that thing. And when you come back to the purpose that you were trying to do, the experience is not of volitional action to where you were aware of what's going on and you chose to get distracted and now come back. It's more an experience of something just happens where that part of you that was trying to focus on the breath has now noticed that it's gone and it just comes back, right? So there's kind of this continual experience of shuffling between kind of different modes of, or one way to frame this would be perhaps different systems of the mind are kind of taking control of your attention and pulling it in different ways. And I think you can, you know, that's the meditation context. I think you can have that experience just in daily life as well. If you notice you're reading a book or something and your mind wanders, right? And you notice that your mind has wandered, the experience at that moment is not really of a volitional choice to come back. It's of, oh, this just happened. I just noticed I was lost. I didn't choose to want to let my attention wander away from what I was reading or doing. It just happened, and now I'm back, right? So I'd be curious to get your perspective on that kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were describing that I do experience something like that sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. Sometimes I do try to focus on my breath, thinking that will help me fall asleep, as opposed to just letting my mind wander over, you know, whatever happened during the day. I'm excited about something that might have happened and my mind wants to go there, but I have to reduce my level of excitement to fall asleep. So I've rightly or wrongly thought that, well, maybe if I just try to focus on my breath, maybe that'll calm me down from the day and help me relax. But then I find myself wandering, my mind wandering to something that happened in the day. And then at a certain point, I realize, oh, I was supposed to be focused on my breath. Okay, let me get back to that. So in a lot of that, maybe all of that, I don't know about all of it, but so is all of that automatic? Like once I catch my mind wandering and strain from the task of focusing on my breath, do I automatically go back to focusing on the breath? I'm not sure that I do. I think there might be a moment there. It's kind of interesting to quantify it, like a half second, 1 second, 2 seconds, exactly how long is this moment? But there might be a moment where I have this choice of getting myself back to the task of just concentrating on my breath, or just continue to ride my desire to think about what was happening during the day. And I think there might actually be a moment there where it is up to me and I am exerting. I don't automatically go one way rather than the other. There's a kind of fork in the road, and I I I just make a choice which fork to go down or which tine to go down. Um, so I guess the catching of myself as being off task, I think that is automatic. But then whether to get back on task or just allow myself to keep drifting onto whatever happened during the day, I think that, at least I think that's, I'm not persuaded that that's not automatic. Sorry, I'm not persuaded that is automatic. I think that might be volitional, whether to get back on task or not. I don't know how do you experience it? Were you saying that even the getting back after you've automatically noticed you're off task, whether to get back on task, does that also seem to you to be automatic?
So I think there is, sometimes it seems to just happen. So definitely kind of automatic. Sometimes there is effort involved, and we can maybe hypothesize about whether effort is synonymous with volition or not. But I think, so let's hypothesize that you do have a volitional choice in that moment to come back to the task that you were trying to do, focus on the breath, or to let your mind continue to wander. And maybe let's see if we can get clear on what exactly is making that choice and what grounds does it have to make the choice one way or the other, right? So one hypothesis here would be, yeah, maybe there's effort involved in that choice, at least some of the time. You have to exert effort to come back. And one hypothesis would, in this sort of mind system, modular mind view, would be there's some part of your brain that has done some calculation and decided. I hesitate to use words like decided because those are kind of consciousness associated terms, but whatever sort of the physical correlate of deciding something is, some sort of equation, to simplify it, decided to exert that effort and come back, versus some other times your brain might decide that effort is not worth exerting and just let your mind wander. I've definitely had both experiences at different times. And then the alternative hypothesis is there is some sort of central entity that is making that choice that is not determined by any of your brain processes, right? So just first of all, would you say you kind of agree with the second hypothesis there, that there is sort of a central sort of mental entity there that makes that decision to exert that effort or not in that moment?
Yeah, I think at least some of the time. I mean, there are times where it's that there's that fork in the road, and something happens in my brain that forces me to go down one of the paths. But even if that's true, I think it's plausible that there, at least sometimes, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like it is up to me as this mental, in this mental entity sense, deciding which path to go down.
Okay. So, yeah, so I guess if we hypothesize that that is true, I think just the raw experience can kind of satisfy both hypotheses. Because you don't generally introspect anything. There's no conscious cause for you going one way or the other. You're conscious of this sort of potential of doing either of these things, and you sort of experience that decision to go one way or the other as just happening as a first cause. So I say just happening, but there is a certain experience in that just happening that's different from the experience of like an emotion or a thought just popping into your mind. And I think the additional thing in that kind of voluntary choice is sort of this experience of effort, or of what you could call being a self making that decision, right? So if we hypothesize that this mental entity is making that decision, I guess what are the grounds by which it makes that decision? So if that decision is not determined, so okay, so where I'm going with this is it seems like that mental entity is sort of identityless in some sense. It's without kind of content with which it would make this type of decision. If that decision is not determined by it's not determined by your values or your emotions, or some physical process that we don't have introspective awareness of, the entity that makes that decision, you have to strip away all these things that you might normally think of as part of yourself, your self-identity, your memories, your ideas, thoughts, etc. If you strip all that away, because that can't be a factor in this kind of, well, it can't be determinative of this kind of fundamental volitional decision, what is left? It seems like there's not really much left. If that is yourself, if that mental entity is you, it seems like there's not much there. It's just kind of a structureless nothing, right? That decides, that maybe has a first person experience, but that just kind of decides one way or the other, right? Does that make sense at all? I'm not sure if I'm communicating this very clearly.
I think I see what you're getting at. So I think one thing you're doing is you're pointing out that there's no motivation for the choice to go one way rather than the other.
Yeah, it seems like at some point, you could go down a chain of, I did this action because I was motivated by such and such, but then why did I choose to be motivated by that instead of by some other thing? So one common place this would arise is like, there's a decision that I think is good for me. I want to lay on my couch all day instead of working, right? It's like one possible motive is, I want the feeling of relaxing and laying around all day. And one possible motive is, I know that I need to work to make money, and it's not good to just lay all day and eat ice cream, right? At some point, there has to be a sort of irreducible decision that is not motivated, right? Because you're choosing between these motives, right? And if you strip away all the motives and you strip away all the other factors that you would normally think of as relating to your decision, this core kind of basic choice to go one way or the other seems like it has to be made kind of in a vacuum. It's just, you just do it. And it doesn't seem like that makes sense logically to me. And it doesn't, maybe getting back to our discussion of focus earlier, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily powerful to have that choice or particularly significant. It's just like, how is that better than randomness in some sense?
So I think maybe another way to put your point is that you're wondering about is this an arbitrary choice? If there, I guess if there were grounds to choose one way rather than the other, it wouldn't seem arbitrary, but it also wouldn't seem like a choice, because whatever those grounds were, that would be the cause of you.
Yeah, it wouldn't seem, you can talk about whether it's possible to have a non-volitional choice. Like you can go through a thought process of deliberation and you could kind of call that a choice. But in this sort of fundamental sense of volitional choice, yeah, it seems like the ultimate volitional choice has to be essentially without grounds. And I know there are kind of arguments in objectivist literature about why that choice is not arbitrary in a technical sense, I guess. But whether you want to call it arbitrary or unmotivated or groundless, it seems like there is that fundamental fact of, if you have that sort of irreducible choice, it just kind of is there, and it doesn't seem really distinguishable from if you were just looking at that kind of extrospectively and ignored the experience of effort that goes along with it. What's different from that choice than just a random selection, right?
Well, I suppose one might say here that in a way there's always a motivation that governs one's choice, even the primary choice, and that is that one's always in reality. And I guess there's, so I mean, is it, there might be different kinds of motives. So I've heard Harry Benslinger has used the term metaphysical motive somewhere, I forget where, to describe the kind of motivation there is for the primary choice, as opposed to what has been called secondary choices. So the choice of what career to have or what to eat for breakfast. These are choices about particular content. But if we're before that stage of choosing, like if you're already in focus, then you might engage in a thought process as to which career you should have or what you should eat for a certain meal. But if you're not in focus yet, if you're just kind of drifting in a semi-conscious daze, to use one of Ayn Rand's phrases, is there something that could motivate you to choose to get into focus rather than not? And I think there's a sense, I think, at least I have a sense, if I'm drifting, that it would be better for me to be in focus than not. So I think that sense that I have, kind of an implicit emotional sense, provides grounds for choosing one way on the primary choice. But it doesn't determine me. It wouldn't be a choice then. It doesn't force me to go in that way, that I have this sense it would be better for me to go in. So I have this sense that there is an option, and that it would be better to go down one horn of the option, mixing metaphors here. I'm thinking of horns of dilemmas, one path. I have the sense it would be better to go down one path, namely the focus path, but that I don't have to. It's just up to me. So I don't know if I've, so you think you're presenting this as like, why isn't it just arbitrary? And I think I guess what I'm suggesting here is that it's not arbitrary because you have this sense, or at least I think people in general have the sense that it would be better to go down one path. And I think maybe part of the proof that one really does have this sense is that one feels guilty if one doesn't go down it. I think I've experienced like, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done what I did. I had this sense I could have done otherwise, and I should have done otherwise than I did. And because I didn't do that, I now feel guilty, remorseful, regret. And I think, I mean, if you have any of that kind of experience, I think that might be some evidence that it's not arbitrary. Because if it really were arbitrary, if it didn't make any difference which path you went down, then why would you feel regret or guilt for going down one path? Yet we all feel that sometimes, I think. At least we all feel guilt in some cases, maybe not necessarily in connection with the primary choice, but I think, I suspect many people feel it in connection with, somehow in connection with that primary choice. So I think this sense we have that it's better to choose one way rather than the other takes the arbitrariness out of it. So those are, I mean, that's some initial thoughts I have on that.
Okay. Can we actually take a quick break?
Sure.
I don't know if you have the ability to cut videos later.
Oh, I can pause it.
Okay, sure.
All right. Okay.
All right.
We're back. I was just thinking that there might be a tension between two things I was saying. So earlier I said that when I try to sleep, sometimes it can be helpful to not choose to focus, to just let your mind drift. Maybe that helps calm you down. But here in the last several minutes, we've been talking about how it helps me to sleep, or I think it helps me to sleep, not to drift, to focus on this task of my breathing, for instance. And that if I were to allow my mind to drift to whatever happened during the day, that would get me excited because maybe something interesting happens. So I'm not sure, like, what is the best way to get to sleep? Is it to let my mind drift, or is it to focus my mind on this task of breathing? I don't know. And maybe it varies from day to day. Like maybe if I had a boring day, it would be most helpful to just let my mind drift. And
if you figure that out, let me know. It's kind of a scientific question, I guess. But I also have sleep issues sometimes, and I've tried both ways of letting my mind wander versus trying to focus on something and relax, count sheep, or focus on the breath or whatever. And neither method seems to be foolproof, in my case at least.
Yeah, I've gotten much better at sleep over the years. Maybe in a kind of different way than we're discussing now. But yeah, I have definitely not mastered the art of getting to sleep. So yeah, maybe that's an area, I think it is an area of psychology or medicine that there's a lot of room for improvements. And maybe it overlaps with philosophy, all this talk about free will. What exactly is the self and what do we have control over, if anything?
Yeah, maybe if you think about that, you'll fall asleep more easily.
Possibly.
Yeah, okay, so you brought up a couple things. So there was this question of kind of whether the choice is arbitrary, and then you brought up as a reason that it might not be arbitrary that we have emotions like guilt, basically that we have some sense that there, at least in hindsight, there was a right decision, and whether we made it or not. And if we feel that we made the right decision, then we might experience positive emotions. If we feel that we made the wrong decision, we might experience negative emotions. And I think that is definitely true. But I think there's sort of a puzzle if you think that there is this irreducible choice that you're making, like kind of as I was describing earlier, all these things like emotions like guilt or pleasure or whatever seem like they are sort of an evolutionary mechanism to try to push you to make certain types of decisions one way or the other, right? And they're not always right. But if there is this sort of irreducible choice that is not determined by any particular motivation, even if you might have some of these things in consciousness, it seems like there is a, if you think that your choice to do X was motivated by a certain factor in consciousness, there's kind of a deeper choice to why did you choose that motivation instead of some other one, right? Either your choice was determined by that that emotion or idea or whatever that you had in mind that made you think this choice was right, or you're not determined, and then there is a deeper choice for why you let that be the factor that guides your action rather than some other factor, right? And I'll just say, I think this puzzle kind of goes away if you assume that underlying choice is deterministic, or at least made at an unconscious level by some system that you don't have full insight into. So if you assume that there is some sort of brain system that is weighing things in your experience and perhaps other factors that are not in conscious awareness, that is ultimately making that decision for you, I feel like things like emotions and just deliberative actions that involve weighing various options in general kind of make more sense from a logical perspective. Whereas if you think that there's this irreducible choice, it's kind of a puzzle of how one of these factors gets activated versus another one, and why these various emotions and other things exist trying to influence that choice when that choice is irreducible. And there is something that is not determined by any other factors that is ultimately going to decide on some, whether you call it arbitrary or not, some non-grounds, just decides to go one way or the other.
Okay. Okay, so one thought on that is, I think that there are grounds for going either way. Like going back to the sleep example, trying to get to sleep. So I think there are, I have this sense, at least sometimes, that it would be better for me to focus on the breath. And that sense motivates me to focus on the breath, and sometimes I do. But I also have a desire. There's something motivating me to just let my mind wander, because it's interesting to think about what happened during the day. Sometimes I want to re-experience that in my mind, and so I'm pulled in both directions, and it's up to me. And I might also sense that it's better to go in one direction than the other. So, but either way I go, there was a motive. There was something pulling me there. It wasn't just arbitrary. You could say, well, if I focused on the breath, well, it's because I thought it was more important to get to sleep, and I thought it was good for me to get to sleep. If I indulged, my thoughts about what happened during the day, well, it's because that was exciting, and it was enjoyable to re-experience that. So there's a reason either way you go, but but simultaneously I think I have the sense that one of those reasons is more important to side with, and so I guess I feel better about going that way rather than the other, at least in certain cases.
But that feeling didn't determine you to go that way. There's still some underlying I just chose factor in addition to those reasons, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So I guess the maybe the arbitrariness, there's a way to say, well, it's not really arbitrary whichever way you go. There's a reason that explains why you did it. But there's also a sense in which there is no answer to the why. It's just a brute choice. And I know Dr. Peikoff says this in a certain passage of his book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, which I think I can find pretty quickly where that is. In chapter 2, he says, this is on page 60, it is invalid to ask, why did a man choose to focus? There is no such why. There is only the fact that a man chose. He chose the effort of consciousness, or he chose non-effort and unconsciousness. In this regard, every man at every waking moment is a prime mover. So he says it's actually invalid to ask for a why. That's just the nature of a primary choice. If there were a why, then I guess it wouldn't be a primary choice.
Yeah, so that's maybe kind of what I'm getting at. So if there was such a primary choice, I agree that there can't be a why for it. It has to be just you chose, right? So then I guess I'm left deciding between these two hypotheses about how the mind works, right? In one hypothesis, there is this primary choice that is, in some sense, unmotivated. There's no why, you just do it. And then in the second model of the mind, or the second hypothesis, is that choice does have a why, but it's below the level of consciousness. It's something that happens in your brain that you aren't able to introspect. And so if you think so to me, the second, just introspectively and in terms of my limited knowledge of neuroscience and psychology, the second possibility seems more plausible to me. So I'm curious, what is the grounds for accepting the first hypothesis rather than the second one? The grounds for thinking that there's really this primary choice that you just make that has no why, versus it's just something that there is a why, but you don't know what it is.
Yeah, that's, I think that's an interesting question. I guess one might say to that, well, the grounds are just introspective. It just seems to, when I introspect, that I'm just making this primary choice. I wasn't forced to go one way rather than the other. I just did go one way. And I guess if you were to take the other hypothesis, that, well, really there was something in my brain that forced me to go one way. Well, you would need evidence. I don't know what would be, how would you establish that? So you mentioned neuroscience, and but I don't know how neuroscience would establish that. I'm not very familiar with neuroscience, and I know that some neuroscientific data that has been used to challenge free will has also been itself challenged. So there's the famous Libet experiments of like you're instructed to move your finger at random, and people say that they chose at a certain time to move their finger, but then because of these electrodes that are hooked up to the scalp or whatever, the researchers see, oh, there was actually something in the brain that happened prior to the time that the person reported making the decision. And maybe it was that prior thing that happened in the brain which caused them to move their finger at a certain time. So that these sorts of interpretations of the Libet experiments have been challenged. In particular, there's a book by Al Mealy. He's a philosopher at Florida State who's written a book called Free Will, which takes on these Libet experiments, and he thinks that they don't show that there's a lack of free will. Now there's certainly, I think plausibly, there's always stuff going on in the brain, and I don't doubt that corresponding to either of the paths you could select between, like if we're selecting between letting your mind wander and staying on task of focusing on your breathing, I have no doubt that there's something that correlates to both of those paths going on in the brain. But then if you're actually going to establish the truth of the hypothesis that it was something in the brain that caused you to go one way rather than the other, I'm not aware of any neuroscience that has shown that. And there's also the whole issue of the contradiction of determinism. Is it even coherent to suppose there could be objective knowledge that we're determined? So how does that argument go? It's the contradiction of determinism argument. So I guess there's an implied claim when you say determinism is true, that you have knowledge of this fact. But how do you know? How can you say you know it as opposed to you're just forced to believe it by some deterministic factor? So you might think there's philosophical grounds, independent of any science, to think, well, there just couldn't be knowledge that really determinism is the right hypothesis to explain which
So,
path.
I've seen that type of argument in objectivist literature, and it's usually followed up with, we've shown that there's a contradiction in believing determinism, but this doesn't demonstrate that free will is true. The proof or validation, or whatever term you want to use for free will, is your direct introspective experience, right? And so there is the direct introspective experience of, yes. Okay, so maybe what I'm trying to get at is, what exactly is that direct introspective experience? And does it prove that there is this irreducible choice, or is it compatible with some other interpretation, right? Because it's not quite an experience like, I see this cup, therefore the cup is there, right? I don't think the introspective experience of volitional choice is quite like that. It's more, you experience certain things and then you infer conceptually that this means that there is an introspective choice. And this maybe gets to the arguments about the self and things like that. Like, you don't directly perceive the self, but maybe you perceive various other things that conceptually lead to this idea of a self, right? But it seems to me that the introspective experience of exerting effort and of perceiving an alternative and of making a decision without any conscious determining factor there, that's basically the evidence for volition. And it seems like that introspective data is also compatible with other interpretations, such as the interpretation that there are non-volitional systems that determine the outcome, right? Yeah, so I guess it's just, it seems like it could go either way, and then it becomes kind of, so I get the contradiction of determinism argument, and I'm sensitive to that. But if you go on the level lower than that of what is the introspective data for that, for volitional choice, it seems like it's not decisive to me.
Yeah, I don't know if it is. I guess so. One thought that comes to mind is there like a default, like between those two hypotheses? Should we default to just taking the introspective data at face value, rather than defaulting the other way, that there's something in the brain forced you to go one way rather than the other? Which if either of those two explanations should we default to? Another thought is about the cup. You said, well, it's not like the seeing a cup here. I guess the idea that being that, that's stronger evidence. We can take that at face value. But I don't know, can we? I mean, I think a similar style of argument is made against arguments in favor of there's an external world. So, Descartes famously said, well, it's compatible with everything that I observe, that I'm in a dream, that I'm dreaming right now, or that I'm deceived by some evil demon. Yeah, it seems like there's a cup here, but there might not really be a cup. It's just could be a figment of my imagination. I could be, just in the Matrix or something. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat. So should we default to just taking at face value that things are as they appear? There really is a cup, and we really do have this volitional control, and the burden is on the person who denies that. Is that the right way to structure the dialectic here? I guess I have I feel like saying, yeah, the burden should be on the person who wants to say there's an evil demon and there's not really a cup here, or the person who says, you know, this call could just be a dream, or the one who says, oh, it's really the brain who's making us decide this. I guess because the prima facie, on first glance, things seem to be a certain way. It doesn't seem like, I have no evidence that the brain is causing me to choose one way. Now, maybe you can do your neuroscience, setting aside the whole worries about contradiction of determinism. Maybe you can take me into your neuroscientific lab and show me, okay, well, this is why you should believe it really is the brain. But that's a burden you have to discharge. You have to take me into your lab and show me. I shouldn't default to that. Likewise with the dream case, so I think that the dreaming case, at least, is an arbitrary. There's no evidence in favor of thinking that you are dreaming. You would have to provide some evidence to establish that. Do you need evidence that you're not dreaming, or is that asking someone to prove a negative? If so, I think there's a logical reason that you wouldn't. That's not a burden you need to satisfy. Likewise, do I need to prove that there's not something in my brain that's causing me to go one way rather than the other? Or is that asking someone to prove a negative? So these are some of the considerations that come to mind in thinking about this issue of how do we decide between these two hypotheses. I tend to think that the burden, because of where the prima facie evidence is, that the burden is on the person who wants to say it's the brain. And absent any of that evidence, that it actually is the brain that's making the choice, it's reasonable to default to the idea that it's this mind. And furthermore, I haven't been exposed to any neuroscientific evidence that makes me think, yeah, it really is the brain, so I should ignore my prima facie evidence that it's my mind and go with the other hypothesis. I haven't seen any evidence that makes me think, yeah, I should really. Now, people, like Libet, or at least some interpreters of Libet say, yeah, there is neuroscientific evidence, but I haven't been convinced by that, and people like Mealy and others haven't been convinced. So I guess ignoring the whole contradiction of determinism issue, I guess I would want to say I'm open in principle to the idea that the brain hypothesis, let's call it, could be right, but I just haven't been exposed to that evidence. So by default, I side with the prima facie evidence that it's the mind that's choosing the path.
Okay, that makes sense. So I'll make a couple comments on that, and then I think we're getting close to 2 hours, so maybe we can wrap up. So you had mentioned via our correspondence before this that you had watched Leonard Peikoff's lecture on Hume when he was talking about the self, and I went back and listened to that as well before this, and I think that is to some extent relevant here. So earlier in that lecture, Peikoff was talking about Hume's argument for the non-existence of the external world, essentially. And I think it's interesting that Peikoff's counter to Hume in that case is different from his counter to Hume on the self. Peikoff's argument for the existence of the external world and entities is essentially that we directly perceive them. So that the argument for the existence of this cup is I perceive this cup as a unified entity, and that's my direct level of awareness of it, right? And I can analyze it by saying it's clear, it's got glass, it has a certain texture, but that is analysis of the direct perception of the entity, right? And then later when he's talking about the self, Hume makes this argument that we don't perceive a self inside our heads. We perceive just experiences of different things. And Peikoff's argument is that all of those, we can integrate all of those different perceptions, find some commonalities between them, and infer conceptually that there must be an entity that is doing the experiencing, right? So it's kind of a different argument. One is, this is just here, I directly perceive it. And one is, I have this evidence that I've integrated conceptually, and now I've decided that this thing exists, right? And I think to me, it seems like the argument for volition from introspective experience is closer to the second case than the first case, where we don't directly perceive something called volition. We don't directly perceive that there are alternatives and that we could metaphysically go either way, and that if I went back in time, I could have made a different choice, that sort of thing, right? We perceive sort of potentialities, we perceive effort, we perceive that there is no conscious choice underneath our action to go one way or the other. And based on that, we infer that there is this thing that we call volition that means there's this irreducible choice to go either way. And I feel like in contrast to the direct perceptual entity of the cup, which you can't really get under, you can only analyze it, that type of inference, that conceptual argument for the existence of something is subject to being integrated with all of our other knowledge, including neuroscience and psychological experiments and all that. And you mentioned a few of those and why they're maybe not decisive. But it seems to me that, again, not necessarily decisive, but if you take evolutionary biology and what knowledge we do have of the brain as a system with various, parts that perhaps evolved at different times and interact with each other in a sort of distributed way, and then these experiments in psychology, other things that, Harris mentions these like split brain experiments and things like that. It all sort of adds up to, I think, it integrates better with the idea that there is something underlying this choice, that this thing that we called volition actually refers to some underlying brain process rather than this irreducible choice. And the jury's out, I guess, as evidence comes in on either side of that argument. It may swing one way or the other, but it seems to me the kind of thing that you have to integrate with all your other evidence and decide on that basis, rather than actually something we directly perceive like a physical entity in the world.
Okay.
But I do see your point that if you were somebody 500 years ago or something like that, you don't understand what the brain does, you don't have any of the psychological evidence. It makes sense, I think, for you to say, I perceive this decision going one way or the other. That feels different to me than these sort of automatic things that happen in my mind, emotions popping in randomly, etc. Therefore, I'm going to hypothesize that there's something fundamentally different about that, and there's no prior cause. But I feel like in a modern context where we have more scientific knowledge, that hypothesis becomes less plausible. But I also get the sense that objectivism would not see this as a hypothesis, that Rand and other objectivist philosophers would take the view that you directly experience this thing called volition. And I'm not sure that I agree with that, just based on my own introspective experience.
So you would say, well, just on the basis of your own introspective experience, uh, it doesn't even see a lot of determinists will acknowledge that at least seems that they have free will, but then they'll just go on to say, well, it's just an illusion. Why? Well, because we've got this neuroscientific evidence like Libet's that shows that we're really not free when we think we are.
Yeah, so
But
this
it
is something.
still seems like it, at least. But are you saying
Yeah,
it sounds like you're maybe going beyond them and saying it doesn't even seem introspectively?
yeah. So that's essentially the argument that Harris makes. Not, I don't think he makes it in his book on free will, but he makes it in the the Waking Up book and in the meditation course. That I think one of his phrases is the illusion of free will is itself an illusion, or something like that, right? So he thinks that if you really examine introspectively what's going on when you think you're making a volitional choice, the experience isn't decisive in the sense that it. So he might say actually that it doesn't even feel like there is a grounds for hypothesizing that there is a volitional choice. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but I think he would definitely say that that introspective evidence is not decisive, that it doesn't, there is a feeling of voluntary choice, but that doesn't, the experience there doesn't imply volitional choice and doesn't necessarily even seem like the kind of thing that is an irreducible, non-deterministic choice made by some central entity that you call yourself.
Mm. That, I guess that's maybe that's an outlier view. That, I mean, if he is saying it doesn't even seem like upon close inspection, it doesn't even seem like there's something that people traditionally mean by free will. I think that's a tough claim to support. I mean, I think a lot of people would say it's just obvious. There's just a mountain of evidence to the contrary. Right now, I am freely controlling. I'm not having a spasm right now. My hand is not twitching. I am controlling this damn thing. At least it sure as hell. It doesn't seem like a twitch. That's the contrast. It's by contrast with a spasm or a twitch that it seems like I'm controlling this. I mean, I think it might be a stolen concept to say everything is automatic. Where do you get this notion of automatic except by contrast with your experience of something that's non-automatic, something that seems volitional? Where did you, Harris, get this idea that everything is determined? By contrast to what? Don't you need a foil? So I'm not sure. I don't know what he would say to that. I don't know if he's got this, I call it the contrast argument.
Yeah, so I think the idea is so there is an experience of that, kind of voluntary hand motion as being different from a muscle spasm, right? But I think his point, whether it's true or not, is that if you really focus your mind in some sense and introspect the act of doing this and the signature that it has in your mind, you see causes for it that aren't apparent if you're not actively kind of deeply introspecting in that way. And at the deepest level, when you get to something that feels like it's just causeless, like the sort of irreducible choice, it seems to just happen and you don't know why it happens, right? I think he talks about this a little bit in the Free Will book. Like he talks about making various decisions throughout his day and he's just like, I don't know why I made that decision. It just happened. And I think that's kind of the point, is like, so imagine I have my hand, so this is kind of like the Libet experiment, right? I guess I have my hand here and at some point I'm going to raise my hand, right? I experience that raising of my hand as voluntary, but why did I raise it now instead of half a second earlier or half a second before that, right? It seems like there has to be some cause there. And then if you go backward in the causal chain to the thing that seems irreducible, it seems like something that just happens. I think that's the argument anyway. So yeah, that's what I found intriguing about this kind of meditation material is I had never seen that argument before. I'd always seen the arguments that, well, yeah, it does seem like we have free will, but there's this other evidence that seems to contradict it. And I was never that convinced by that. But if introspectively, it doesn't even seem like there is this volitional choice, if it seems like your introspective experience is more compatible with deterministic brain systems kind of doing their thing, then that's kind of a totally different class of argument, right? And I'm not 100% convinced of that. That's what I'm trying to kind of work through, I guess. But I would say, you know, as I get deeper into this material, I become sort of more convinced that that model fits the introspective evidence better. Again, without being able to share our introspective evidence and point to here's what we're seeing or feeling or whatever, it's hard, but that's the basic idea.
I think there is some, I don't know if the hand motion is the best example to use because, you know, that's not, most of this conversation we've been talking about the primary choice to think or to focus as being like the irreducible primary choice, not the choice to move your hands this way or that. Yeah, I mean, it does seem when I introspect on this hand motion, it does seem like, it doesn't feel like a spasm. It feels like I'm controlling it, but it also isn't the primary choice. I guess I've already chosen to focus on having this discussion, and this seems like maybe it would be an example to illustrate some aspect of the discussion, so I use it. So maybe the hand motion would be, in this instance, it would be a secondary choice. And I think there's an interesting question on exactly how does secondary choices relate to primary choices. You did ask the question like, well, why did I choose to move the hand now rather than a half a second later? And I mean, is the answer to that because something happened in my brain now rather than half a second later? Or is it, or should one rather say, well, it's just because I chose to move it now rather than half a second later? And I think maybe this again gets to these two hypotheses, like introspectively, the reason I chose to move it now rather than half a second later is because it seems that I just chose to move it now. And then you could float the competing hypothesis. Well, it's because something in your brain made it happen now rather than half a second later. Okay, but then isn't the burden on the person who wants to say that to provide the neuroscientific evidence? And maybe it is. I guess it is because you don't have direct access to the fact that you even have a brain. So
right.
You first need to discover that and then show that there actually was something in the brain that made it impossible for you to decide to move it at a different time. So I think this might, again, be a burden of proof issue. I guess two other thoughts. One is, well, just one for now. I mentioned earlier how maybe you could get yourself into a state where it really is the brain that's causing you to do one thing rather than the other. But that's because that might be because you've already decided to surrender the reins of your mind. And then once you've made that choice, then you just have these competing factions, these modules of your brain, maybe. So I think it could be that the brain is like, so maybe Harris is the type of person, I don't know, who surrenders his mind. And then once he's made that choice, he surrenders the reins of mind, then he introspects and observes that it doesn't seem to be him that's causing him to do one thing rather than the other. And then he comes back and reports, oh, well, my introspective experience when I paid really close attention is that it's not really me in control. There is no free will here. So there's an illusion of free will. But is that just because he's introspecting after he's made the choice to let his mind drift? But that choice to let his mind drift, was it he made that choice freely? Maybe. Anyways, that's some thoughts on the last segment.
All right. Yeah. So that's probably a pretty decent place to wrap up. So I'd be interested, aside from all this, just if you could give a brief description of kind of what your research was on specifically in your graduate work.
Oh, yeah. Well, as a master's student, I wrote a thesis on a certain theory of free will. I think I might actually have it here. I don't know if you can read the spine there. O'Connor's agent puzzle theory of free will.
So
that was
official.
Yeah, this is the official logo of California State University, Long Beach.
Okay. And
so he's a what's called a libertarian about free will. So there are different, broadly speaking, there are compatibilists and incompatibilists. That's one way, at least, to divide up the landscape on people who are engaged in the free will debates. So the compatibilists, they argue that free will and determinism are actually compatible. They're not mutually exclusive, and which is kind of the assumption we've been having during this discussion. There's these two opposed views. Either you can favor that there's free will, or that there's everything is determined. But the compatibilists, which actually are the majority among academic philosophers, and I think they have been for decades, have argued, actually, you don't have to choose between these. We're both free and determined. But then I would argue that what they call free isn't really freedom. Sometimes they gloss it as being able to do what you want to do, even if you're forced to do. So they'll contrast being constrained, like physically in chains. So you're not free if you're in chains or if you're in jail, but you are free, I guess, within the jail, as long as you can choose to walk from one side of the prison to the other or something. Nothing's constraining you to the wall. You can at least go around. Now they might say, well, it's because you had a desire to walk to one side of the room rather than the other. And that's what caused you to walk around. So you couldn't have done otherwise, in some sense. But they do say that you could have done otherwise in the sense that if you had a different desire, you could have not walked across the room. So they I think they changed the meaning of terms in order to get their compatibilism to work. And I don't think it's successful in the end, but anyways, there's a lot of philosophers who try to integrate free will and determinism, as well as moral responsibility. So they think you can both be determined and also be morally responsible, which I, again, don't think works, but they try to integrate them. But this guy's theory, Timothy O'Connor, who I was writing about, he's not in the compatibilist camp. He's an incompatibilist. So I agreed with him on that. But then within the incompatibilist camp, there are subcamps. So there's broadly three. There's the agent causalists, the event causalists, and the non-causalists. And he is an agent causalist. So he will explain actions in terms of an agent. So why did some event happen? Well, it's simply because some agent caused it to happen. A self, you might say. It's not because there was some events like the coming to be of a desire in one's mind, a desire to move my arm, suppose, and that event is what caused my arm to move. Rather, it was simply me, the agent, who caused my arm to move. I am the cause of the arm's motion.
Yeah, so that kind of gets to what we were talking about with why did I move my hands now versus half second prior, right? Was there an event that caused me to move my hand at that point, or did I just do it? And you can't get below that or ask why. It just is, right?
Right. It's just an irreducible cause, the agent, on the agent causalist view. And I'm not sure that's like I don't know that I would put myself in one or the other of those camps. I think that might be a false alternative. And for a while, I thought I'm in the agent causal camp. And I know some other objectivist philosophers who have, it seems like they're inclined towards the agent causal view, agent causal libertarian view. For anyone who doesn't know the term libertarian, it's not the political kind of libertarian. There's a special use of the term libertarian within the free will literature that simply means you have the power to do A or non-A in a given set of circumstances. You could have done otherwise in a given set of circumstances. But in further researching exactly what the agent causal libertarians take their view to be, I kind of wanted to get off the bus, off the agent causal bus, and I had some reservations about it. So what I do in this thesis is I critique one agent, probably maybe the most prominent agent causal libertarian theory I could find in the academic literature. I raised some objections to it and proposed some alternative ways of thinking about free will, so that it's, from one perspective, it is an agent that causes things, but from another perspective, there is an event that causes actions at a certain time. So that was my master's work. And then for my PhD work, I shifted my focus to another, maybe nearby area of philosophy called the philosophy of mind, which deals with the metaphysical status of the mind or consciousness. The big question which I address is the mind physical, or is consciousness physical or material? So you'll have materialists who think that, again, science, like a lot of people in the free will literature, they say, well, scientific evidence tells us that determinism is true. Likewise, in the philosophy of mind literature, a lot of people think that scientific evidence tells us that materialism is true, or a term used more often these days is physicalism is true. The mind is something physical, or the consciousness is physical. So I don't have a copy of my dissertation here right now. I've got one ordered on the way, but the title of it is A Critique of the Scientific Case for Physicalism. So I look into the scientific arguments that philosophers have given. In particular, there's two. David Papineau. Yeah, here's the book. He wrote a book called Thinking About Consciousness. And he was actually on my committee. He's the main person who I engage in debate with in the dissertation. He's maybe the most prominent person who's arguing that there's scientific evidence that the mind is physical. And I address his arguments. I argue that his arguments don't work. And there's prima facie evidence that the mind is non-physical, and there's not good scientific evidence to overturn that prima facie evidence. So it's reasonable just to default to what might be called the dualist position, where you've got just two irreducibly different things. You've got mental stuff and physical stuff, or you could maybe put it in terms of properties. You have mental properties and physical properties, and neither is reducible to the other. So this is often called dualism. So, and dualism, it comes in different forms. There's substance dualism, there's property dualism. Descartes famously is a substance dualist, holding that the mind is some kind of substance or entity. In his view, it can exist apart from the body. That's what a substance is. It can exist on its own. It's self-subsisting. I don't accept that kind of dualism, but I think at least prima facie, there's reason to think that mental properties are different than physical properties. For instance, your mind might have the property of being confused about something, but can physical stuff like atoms be confused? Well, that might seem kind of weird. How can atoms be confused? I can see how a mind can be confused, but can like material stuff be confused? Not clear that they can be. In materialists, they have arguments to try to establish, yeah, in the end, it might seem weird at first. And Papineau acknowledges this, that he takes on this burden, but he acknowledges, yeah, the materialist has a burden. It's not intuitive that the mind is a physical thing. And I think he and many others think that there's a prima facie case for dualism, and that there's a burden on the physicalist to establish that the mind is physical, but they think they can meet that burden. And he tries to argue in his book that there actually is good evidence. There's a famous argument called the causal argument that he runs. And so a big part of my dissertation is addressing the causal argument. One of its premises in particular, called the causal closure of the physical. The idea that for every physical cause, there's a physical effect that can account for, for every physical effect, there's a physical cause that can account for the physical effect. So if a molecule swerves in a certain way, that's a physical effect. Well, according to this principle of causal closure, there's some physical cause that led to that molecule swerving. You don't ever need to appeal to anything non-physical to explain any physical effect that happens in the world. And that's a key principle that's used in this, what's called the causal argument. And I challenge that principle, and I say there's actually not good evidence for it, and therefore the causal argument doesn't work. And therefore, and that's the key argument for physicalism that Papineau uses. So I say the argument for physicalism doesn't work. So that is my dissertation and master's thesis in maybe not a nutshell. I went on for a while there, but.
Yeah, so would you agree that at some point, as neuroscience and just physics evolves, we will ultimately have to discover some new, I think Harry Binswanger has called it, a new force of nature, or just something that we don't currently know of, that somehow our model of physics is incomplete, and that someday we're going to discover something that explains, oh, here's how mental entities or events, or the whole conscious world acts on the physical brain, and vice versa.
I at least wouldn't want to rule that out. So it's in his metaphysics of consciousness course, where he mentions that that there is this scientists will discover this new force of nature. I guess he gets to this conclusion by first arguing that there's just this irreducible difference between consciousness and matter. Matter is not consciousness, and consciousness is not matter. They're just two distinct things. They have these different properties, like I was talking about. One can be clear or confused, whereas matter can't be clear or confused. So first, he establishes that there's this difference in properties between consciousness and physical stuff. And then furthermore, he says, well, consciousness has causal efficacy. It's not just this epiphenomenon, which has no causal power. When I move my hand, it's caused by my mental aspect or properties. My mind causes my arm to move, and my mind is not physical. So there must be some non-physical force that's causing this physical event in the world. And you trace the causation back. Like you could say, oh well, my hand is moving because my shoulder muscle flexed, and that flexed because some neurons fired in my shoulder, and those neurons fired because some neurons in my motor cortex in my brain fired. So you can trace it back, but at a certain point you can't trace it to anything physical, at least if you're going to take it at face value that your mind was the ultimate cause of this. You were a prime mover in getting your arm to move, and it was your mind that caused your arm to move. And your mind is not physical because there are these property differences between the mind and physical stuff. So there must be a non-physical force, the force of your mind. So maybe he mentions in his lecture that, well, maybe if you trace it back far enough, there will be some electron in the brain that swerves in a way that can't be accounted for by the other physical forces operating on it. Factor in all the electromagnetic forces, force of gravity, all the physical forces which are known to operate in the rest of the world. Well, add all those up, you're still not going to be able to explain why this particle in the brain swerved, because we know that your mind caused your arm to move. It has causal efficacy, and your mind is not physical because it has these property differences. So there must be some non-physical force. So this is going to be the new physical force that he thinks we discovered. And I mean, I think that's a reasonable view to hold. I don't have an argument against it. I'm sympathetic to that view myself. So it's, I mean, just saying it sounds a little weird or kooky, but maybe it shouldn't. I don't know if it always feels like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that's sort of, so I think I agree with that argument as well. I think it just maybe sounds weird because it's ambitious to think that philosophically we've proven that physics is incomplete in some way, right? But yeah, I don't really see a way around that personally. If consciousness is real and has causal efficacy, it seems like some sort of force like that will have to be discovered at some point.
And to throw in another premise, it's not reducible to something physical, because a lot of physicalists these days, right, they will grant consciousness is real, consciousness has causal efficacy, but then they add to that consciousness is physical. So you don't get to a new physical, you don't get to a new force.
Yeah. Do you mean physical in the sense that it's identical with brain processes, or physical in the sense that it's something else, but something that is explainable in terms of physical laws that we understand now, like maybe quantum mechanical randomness or something like that? I don't know. I've heard vague speculation to that sort of effect, but I'm not familiar with that literature.
I think different physicalists may say different things to that. A common thing they will say is the mind is the brain, or brain processes. I think there's what's the title? There's a famous article by JJC Smart called Sensations as Brain Processes, I believe. So that's one common view. But, you know, others might be more particular about a certain aspect of the brain. The mind is, or they might say pain is C fibers firing. That's a classic example from the 50s or around there that a lot of people used. I don't know if anyone still holds that, but some people will try to specify it more exactly. But some, like Papineau, will put it more negatively. He'll say the mind is identifiable with something identifiable non-mentally. So he puts that term non in front of mental and just says there's something non-mental that the mind is equivalent to. So anything you explain by reference to the mind, you can also explain by reference to something non-mental. So when I move my arm, you can explain that by saying, well, I had a desire that caused me to move my arm. I wanted to move it, and so it moved. Or you could explain the same thing by saying, in terms of non-mental stuff, instead of talking about desires causing me to move my arm, you could say, well, something in my motor cortex fired, and that's ultimately some molecule in my motor cortex swerved, and that's what led to a chain of events. Other events we could also talk in terms of, other events we could also identify non-mentally without talking about desires or beliefs. So any action, any effect in the physical world can be explained by some non-mental cause. You might also be able to give a mental explanation, but instead of saying that I think he tries to, I guess maybe ward off some objections by not saying exactly what it is physically, but just say it's something non-mental that explains all our physical actions. So we know that the mind is identifiable with something non-mental. The mind has effects, he grants that. But since those effects can be explained by non-mind phenomena, like neurons firing, and we don't want to say there's like a duplicate of causes, both the mind and the non-mental stuff are causing it, that would be what's called overdetermination. That would be weird to say any given action, like the motion of my arm, has two simultaneous causes that have like independent origin. Both the mind and the neurons are causing this one event. That would be a weird coincidence. It's kind of like the example that's sometimes used in the literature for explaining overdetermination is a firing squad, death by firing squad. So you've got all these people lined up and they all at the same time shoot a bullet into one guy. Well, what was the cause of the death? Well, you could say it was the first guy's gun or the second guy's or the third guy's. Any bullet by itself would, on its own, have sufficed to bring about the death, we can suppose, for the sake of argument. But if you have multiple such causes, you have what's called overdetermination. You have more than you need to bring about a certain physical effect. Well, that's a very unusual kind of case. Normally, there's not this kind of overdetermination in the world. And Papineau says, well, it'd be weird to think that every time I move my arm, it's like the firing squad, where even if there hadn't been this decision to move my arm, I still would have moved my arm. And likewise, even if the neuron in my brain hadn't fired in my motor cortex, I still would have moved my arm. He says, no, it's weird. You need both of those. you need the neuron to fire, and you also need the decision. But it would be weird to say there's two independent, that those are two independent lines of causation causing your arm to move. So they must be the same thing. We must be able to identify the mental cause with the physical cause in order to avoid this weird situation of one and the same physical effect, namely the arm moving, having two independent lines of causation. The only way to avoid that is by identifying those two causes and saying, really, there's only one cause there. Maybe considered from different perspectives. Like there's the introspective perspective, from which it seems to be a mental cause. And then there's an extrospective perspective, which the scientist can study in the lab. And he'll talk in terms of neurons firing and so forth. But they're really talking about the same thing, but they're kind of opaque to each other. You can't realize by introspecting that you're introspecting on the same thing that the neuroscientist is studying in his lab. But that's nevertheless the conclusion that you have to reach unless you're going to accept something like overdetermination. So I've been...
In that sort of view, do you know if he would think that non-brain processes also have a sort of mental component to them? Or is it somehow only the structure of the brain network that produces this dual perspective? Like if I have a rock sitting on the ground, is there a mental side to that as well that's identical with the physical rock just sitting there?
I believe he would say no. There's no grounds for ascribing mentality to rocks. There is direct grounds for thinking that humans are, and I think he would say other organisms too. So yeah, the idea is that all mental stuff is identifiable with something non-mental, but not the reverse. So it's not that all non-mental stuff is also identifiable with something mental. So the mental is a subset of the non-mental. Yeah, so it's... I was just thinking of whether I should go into one other point, but I don't want to get too off track. Or
yeah, I think we've probably gone long enough, but that's interesting. Yeah, I mean that kind of viewpoint, I'm not familiar with all the academic literature, but that kind of viewpoint seems subject to the criticism that why does the brain have this mental side, and what's the point of it if everything is fully caused by just the physical parts, right? What is so unique about that particular physical system that it has this mental side, and yet everything is fully caused by the physical side, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Why didn't we just evolve to have the physical and not this mental? And I think he might address that and say it's somehow an invalid question, because if the physical is the mental, or sorry, if the mental is the physical, if it's identical, the question of why there isn't just one doesn't arise, or doesn't even make sense. Like, why is there Clark Kent as well as Superman? Why isn't there just Clark Kent? Well, if they're the same person, they have to be.
Right. But if you're talking about them as two different things, or even if you are, you have some grounds to talk about them as two different things, even if you ultimately decide that they are the same thing. It seems like that is, on its face, evidence that there are two different things, right? like the very fact that you have this introspective experience of the mental side of things, even if it is really just the experience of brain processes, uh, it seems analogous to the Clark Kent Superman case in that, yeah, they're ultimately the same thing in some fundamental way, but there are these different aspects. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any grounds for having the names Clark Kent versus Superman to ascribe to these, having two different names to ascribe to the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think I had for a while. I think I was entertaining that objection, and I might have written up something and had it as a section in my one of the drafts of one of my dissertation chapters, and I ultimately didn't use it. I don't remember if that's because I thought of some counter objection that he could come back with, or if I just decided I didn't need, maybe it was a valid objection, but I just didn't need to raise it. It wasn't relevant to my central theme. So it's been, I guess, too many months away from it to recall like what the considerations, but I did at least, I think I was thinking just what you were describing there. And it's a question, good question to raise. And maybe he has something to say to that, but I'm not sure. Yeah, it's been too long since I've looked at it.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so you want to finish up here?
Yep. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts? I don't think so. I'm glad we did this. I enjoyed it, and I've been doing so much on selfishness, but I do have, there are other aspects of philosophy that I'm interested in talking about. So I invite everybody else in the world to get in touch with me. And if you want to have a philosophical conversation about anything, I invite you to. If you want to throw in a donation, that will help. And I encourage you to subscribe to my channel or follow me on Facebook. I don't usually do this kind of plugging for my own stuff in my videos, but I'm trying to grow my channel and build an audience and be able to support myself.
You should probably do this at the beginning instead of after 2.5 hours.
Yeah,
in
maybe
case nobody gets to all the way to the end.
I should cut this clip up and paste it in the front. Anyways, yeah, so there's my little plug for my channel. Do you have anything you'd like to plug here?
Nope, nothing to plug.
Any other closing words?
Nope, this was interesting. It was nice to have this sort of conversation with somebody who is deeply familiar with this sort of material. So yeah, this was valuable to me. Hopefully other people will find it interesting if they watch it online later. I apologize for any verbal flubs or lack of clarity in my speech. I'm not used to this sort of thing.
No worries. Yeah, I stumble around sometimes too. I know in this conversation, there's been times where like you can really see I'm kind of stalling because I'm not sure what to say. But this is difficult stuff. I think it's not always obvious, and it really takes thought to get clear. Whether it's volitional or not, you can be the judge. Okay, all right. Good seeing you, and
Yep.
thanks again for doing this. All right, bye-bye.